So, welcome to episode 9 of our summer series on King David. It's a beautiful summer Sunday out there. It's a long weekend, and here we are to talk about sexual violence and murder and leadership failure and self-deception. So, aren't you glad you came? I'm glad you're here with me. It's not going to be easy. It's not an easy morning. It's not an easy story to process. We're looking at the story of David and Bathsheba out of 2 Samuel. And I know that we've got representatives of the whole church here. I've been working hard to keep this a PG presentation, which is kind of hard given the subject material. So if there are young families here, I'm working hard at it, but in case you have any awkward conversations, uncomfortable questions afterwards, here's a resource that I can recommend for you that you might want to work through with your kids at some point this week. Today, we are going to see David's life turn into a real mess in the sense of something untidy, something dirty, gross, painful. But strangely, that word mess has an older meaning. It means a meal, like as in mess hall. And so I'm glad that we also have that present with us today. We have the Lord's table. This is where we're heading, and we are going to need it by the time we get to the end of the story this morning. So let's dive right into today's mess as we take a closer look at the inner contradictions of David versus David. So last week, in the installment that we heard last week, we saw a real highlight to King David's career. He wanted to build a house for God, he said, but then God turns that wish on its head. God says, you don't need to be building for me. I'm the one who's going to keep building. And then God makes some amazing covenant promises to David. But there's something about that impulse of David's. Why did he feel that he needed to build something for God? There are some important details in that. It seems that he felt that he was mismatched with the God that he was serving. His own palace was a pretty sweet deal. And yet God was living, or the symbol of God, was living in a ratty old tent. And David now felt that it wasn't right for him as king to dial back his lifestyle to match the old tent. And so it's just easier to build a new palace, really, a new temple for God. Another important detail from last week's story is in the opening line, where it says that the Lord gave David rest from all his enemies. So David doesn't need to be out fighting, but then in the next couple of chapters, as we transition to today's story, we see that David is out again, doing battle to the north, to the south, to the east. He's expanding his territory. So what's up with this empire building, David? What's going on here? We are seeing some new things about this man after God's own heart. And then there's this, and this is where it gets really troubling. David is a polygamist. That's right, he's a polygamist. We've heard the names, if we're reading the story, we hear Michal, Ahinoam, Abigail, and at least 4 other wives that are named before we get to today's story. Plus, he's got another collection of wives that will make up his royal household, and all kinds of concubines is the word. That's a legal status that is less than wife. So we need to reckon with the fact that David lived in a rampantly patriarchal society where women are more or less property. And David is fully at home in that world. Now, all of these impulses and practices and values are going to shape what's about to happen as this next story unfolds. So in the spring, in the season when kings go out to war, well, first of all, who knew that war had a season? Perhaps it's kind of like sports, where you do certain things at certain times of the year. And kind of makes you wonder, is there a connection between battle and sports? Now, it does make sense according to the Israelite agricultural calendar. There's a certain time of year when you can let the crops grow, and the working men don't have to be at home. But it still raises the question that, is war something that kings get used to? Is it a habit that they practice until it becomes something that they just do year after year? Anyway, that's where the story starts out. So in the spring of the year, in the season when kings go out to war, David sent his commander-in-chief, Joab, out with the royal army. And they set up a siege around Amman, the same Amman that is still the capital of Jordan. But David stayed behind. Another interesting detail. Now, one evening, as the story goes, David got up from his lounge and was walking around on the rooftop of his palace. Another important detail. From his rooftop vantage, he saw a woman. Now, if you know the story, what was the woman doing? Okay, remember the answer that you just gave. And the verse goes on, she was really good looking. So David sends a servant to find out about her, and he answers. Now, most of your Bibles and the NIV up on the screen gives a straightforward answer. It's Bathsheba. She's Bathsheba. Now, I submit to you that a little Hebrew knowledge helps at this point, because in Hebrew, it's not a simple statement that we've got. We've got a rhetorical question. That is, it's something that suggests that the answer should be obvious. A literal translation would read, "Is it not Bathsheba?" But the wonderful thing about Hebrew is that at this particular point, the Hebrew word loses absolutely nothing in the translation, because the Hebrew word that marks a rhetorical question is hello. That's Hebrew. Did you know that? Hello. Hello. It's Bathsheba, David. Don't you know that? Don't you recognize? She's the daughter of Eliam. She's the wife of Uriah. Both of those guys are in your elite military corps. You should know who this person is. Hello, David. What are you thinking? And in case you didn't catch the name, Bathsheba means something like oath daughter or vow woman. In other words, something that really has strong overtones of fidelity and responsibility. I don't think David is listening to anything that is being said, though, because his next word is simply a command. Go get her. Now, the scripture is very spare here, but this is what it says. David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. And it adds in a way that seems awfully invasive to me as a public disclosure, but it actually is included for her benefit. Now, she was doing her monthly cleansing ritual. So that's included because that signals to us that when she came to David, she was not pregnant. And then she went back home. Okay, we need to stop here for a little bit, because these are a loaded couple of verses. Even if they speak in the barest, most minimalist way, what just happened here? We need to name it. Moral integrity demands that we name it, because it's no longer permissible to ignore, to water down, or excuse what just happened. This was a non-consensual sexual encounter. The common word for this is rape. And it hurts to say that. It hurts because David is a respected biblical figure, and it hurts because this is church. But I've learned in a couple of years of working in an organization, working with people who help those who have been abused, that it's essential that this kind of violence is named, and especially named in church. I've learned a few other things along the way from these co-workers that have taught me lots. I've learned that there are many forms of abuse. There are many kinds of abuse and violence that women put up with that men don't, or in ways that men don't. For example, in terms of sexual violence, women, Canadian women, are 11 times more likely to experience it than men. Violence is deeply shaped by gender. For me as a man, I don't like to hear that. I don't like to say it. But I'm learning that it's not helpful to be defensive. It doesn't work to try and ignore this or explain it away. I've learned that on average, Canadian women, one in 3 Canadian women has experienced some form of abuse, whether that's physical or psychological, financial, social, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse. 1 in 3. And there's no reason to think that for those of you women who are here today, that those stats are any different. And so Bathsheba's story needs to be named for what it is, an experience of gendered sexual violence. Remember these clues that we've seen in the text already. It was war season. Well, why is David at home? Well, it seems he's powerful enough that he can delegate his whole war effort, give it over to Joab. He doesn't need to be the king at the front of his army anymore. But I think there's another power issue that's going on here. It's battle season, and he's got a deep urge that's been shaped and channeled by his culture to conquer something. So why not a personal conquest? Why not a woman as trophy? And then we've got David on the rooftop. That's not just a creepy hangout for some peeping Tom. In Jerusalem's climate, that is the best place to catch the breeze in the cool of the evening. But of course, the palace is the highest ground. That is the king's privilege. And we still build that way. The higher offices are for more senior positions. We talk about upper management, and we turn hierarchy into higher architecture whenever possible. It's the corner office. It's the penthouse suite. Height is symbolic of power and privilege. And David has no problems taking advantage of his privileged viewpoint. And then there's this question of what was Bathsheba actually doing? Was she bathing or washing? What word came to mind when you were asked the question before? It's the same word in Hebrew that is translated both ways in our Old Testament. Earlier translations use the word washing, but for the last century or so, bathing has been the preferred common translation. But in our modern Western culture, bathing is much more intimate. It's usually done indoors, and it's usually done with no clothes. So if we assume that Bathsheba is bathing, we are assuming that she's revealing all, and we are reading our culture into this ancient text, where the Bible actually says nothing about her being unclothed. And if we then assume, as many people have done, as interpreters have done over the centuries and to the present day, that she was actually trying to get David to notice her, that she was the seducer in the situation, well, we are simply blaming the victim. That's what that is. Needs to be named. So, let's go back to the story. She went back home. The woman conceived and sent a message to David. I'm pregnant. Now, obviously, some time has passed between those two sentences. What was the impact on Bathsheba in those weeks? What kind of trauma was she dealing with? What fears? And David, does he even remember that night? Or maybe he's been obsessing on her. We have no way of knowing. The outline of the story is very spare here. But obviously, he was not planning on this. He was not expecting that. And so all of a sudden, it's a problem. All of a sudden, this powerful king feels vulnerable. And he formulates a plan. He's got no time to lose because he needs to trick Bathsheba's husband into thinking that the child is going to be his. So as the story unfolds, as chapter 11 goes on, it's quite a remarkable story. It's almost humorous in a painful, Faulty Towers kind of way if it weren't so tragic. So David has Uriah brought home from the front. He makes some small talk with him, and eventually he tries to get Uriah to go home and have a nice, comfortable home and sleep with his wife. Well, Uriah is the loyal soldier. He will do no such thing. He spends the night with his guards. And David is pretty concerned the next morning when he hears that. So, strike one. The next day, David kind of repeats, but he now uses some alcohol to lubricate Uriah. He gets him drunk and sends him off. He says, okay, now go home, have a good night. Uriah is still the loyal soldier. Even drunk, he knows better. Strike two for David. So David is forced into the ultimate play. If Uriah won't cooperate, he must be eliminated. David sends a secret plan to the commander to arrange to have Uriah conveniently killed in battle. Home run. David continues his conquest with the successful murder of a loyal elite soldier. Oh yeah, a bunch of other troops were lost too, but collateral damage. At least David's reputation remains secure. Nobody's ever going to find out, right? This is a David we haven't seen before. A powerful, power-hungry David. A scared, defensive David. A political animal. More like Saul or Herod or Machiavelli than the ancestor of the Messiah. Sorry, I told you this was going to be a troubling text. Excuse me. Okay, where are we here? It's been a kind of a distracting week for me this past week. I'm just in the midst of a couple of things. Some of you might know that I'm in sort of job transition. I'm working part-time for the summer. The major event that I'm planning is happening next Saturday, and there's been all kinds of road bumps with that. Darlene was gone for a wonderful road trip the last couple of days, and there's lots of weird stuff that's been going on. I don't know if you heard about that bizarre story that was on the news, an Airbnb scandal that happened out west. It was actually some distant relatives, and there's a bit of backstory that I think you'll want to hear about that will make sense. So apparently these people have been doing Airbnb for quite a while, and were totally comfortable with that. But then they got this guest who booked in for a week. Now, they'd never had somebody that long, but maybe that should have been a red flag. It wasn't a problem. But so he booked in for a week. After a couple of days, things started to get weird with this. They saw he was using the main floor bathroom rather than the guest suite bathroom, using the toothpaste. Another day in the middle of supper, this guy just parks himself in the main living room. He's talking on the phone the whole time, just like he owned the place. Awfully annoying. And the next day, it got even worse. When people got home from work, they saw that their own bed had been disturbed. Now, this totally crossed the line, obviously. This is Goldilocks gone bad. And so this guest also, like he's not cluing in. He leaves a note, like a grocery list in the kitchen, as though he's assuming these hosts, my relatives, are going to do the shopping for him. Like, how weird is this? Okay, so at this point, they're ready to kick him out. But when he showed up that evening, he had a whole group of friends with him, 4 or 5 buddies, and they just kind of walk through the kitchen head out onto the deck. And just they park themselves there as though they're going to have, an evening visit. So my relatives go out there and they start listening, and apparently these guys are all lawyers. And so at this point, they're ready to call the cops, but they're not quite sure what to do with this all. And so they figure maybe they'll just wait. It's one more night. This guy is gone the next day, and then they'll just suck it up for one last night. Except he didn't leave the next morning. And this is the part that you probably heard about. The next day, when they got home from work, right, their house is locked against them. The hosts can only get into the garage. And when they get into the garage, what they see there is a little bedroom that has been set up for them. There's a foamy on the floor. There's some boxes with their clothes in it. And on the bed, there's a note written to the hosts. Got a copy of the note here. It's hard to believe. This is what they read. To my gracious hosts, it's with extreme gratitude to your generous hospitality that I announce a change of plans. I've come to appreciate the benefits of your house and the prime location with which you've been blessed. I think you'll find that I will be able to manage this property much more efficiently and productively, and have thus initiated a transfer of title to my name. In the meantime, I'm endeavoring to take care of your needs as best as I can under the circumstances. In lieu of access to your kitchen, please accept this small supply of Tim Hortons gift cards as a token of my concern. It shall be replenished weekly. I hope you'll understand that it was in our best interests to change the locks. You should be comfortable here in the garage until you can find some other suitable shelter. Once again, I must reiterate my gratitude for your hospitality. I sincerely hope this new state of affairs will only be a temporary setback for you, and trust that you will soon find more suitable arrangements for yourselves. On the outside of the envelope, the letter was addressed to my dear hosts, Miss Dewasis, Poundmaker, and Big Bear. And it was signed John Alexander MacDonald. Okay, so I just took a big leap there. But my gut, my heart tells me that it's not that big of a step, actually. I knew I had to go here a couple of months ago when I heard the following statement. A couple of months ago, Darlene and I were in Ottawa. We were at the National Museum. We saw this amazing presentation on Indigenous architects and their work. And the story of one architect, one Indigenous man, telling a bit about his family background, he said this one statement that has just stuck in my heart. He said this: when my grandmother was 13 years old, she was colonized by a white man. When my grandmother was 13 years old, she was colonized by a white man. What that tells me when I let down my defenses is that the experience of Indigenous peoples over the history of European contact and colonization is akin to Bathsheba's experience. It's a story of power imbalance, of desire and conquest and manipulation. Sure, it's not a one-to-one correspondence. The biblical story is about one man and his wrong choices. The Canadian story is about many people, centuries of choices, and the systems that then get put into place, to the point where it feels like we just inherit the problem and we have no choice. But we do. We do. What do we do with this story? So, Nathan the prophet showed up just after David figured he had solved all his problems. And Nathan told David a story too. It was a story about rich and poor, about privilege and abuse and injustice. And David was furious at the injustice. That man deserves to die. Until Nathan told him, "You're the guy. You're the guy." David had a choice. What to do with the story? Reject it? Rewrite it along the lines of George Orwell's Ministry of Truth? That department of propaganda that was there to make sure that Big Brother's government was never wrong. It was the department of excuses and revisionism, of minimization and fake news. No, David accepts the harsh story as the truth that it is. He's undone by it, but he's ready to embrace it. It becomes a real ministry of truth to him, even though it means he's embracing his own failure. It helps that the storyteller is named Nathan, because in Hebrew, Nathan means he gives a gift. There's lots more to the story, both good and bad, and you can read it in chapters 11 and 12 to see where the story goes. Spoiler alert, somebody dies. But this is the tragic turning point in the story of David. The harm that he unleashes here, in the rape of Bathsheba, in the murder of Uriah, comes back to haunt his family and the nation for centuries. Even so, God is at work. The royal sinner is not a lost cause. And when we shift perspective from the external realm of historical chronicles to the interior realm of prayer, we discover some hope. We discover God at work. David, having embraced the hard truth of his own deep thirst for power, having seen the destructive results of how he wielded privilege, David now turns back to God and rediscovers, I'm sure, a better kind of power, the power of divine mercy. He discovers the God who can redeem even the tyrant, even the power-hungry who realize their brokenness. Psalm 51, that we've already met, details David's discovery. David knows the grip that his failure can have on him. The memories could haunt him endlessly. And he brings this before God. "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me," he says. But the next thing he says, I confess I've wrestled with this verse. I've wrestled with when he says, "Against you, you only, God, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And so you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge." I don't like that David says, "Against you only, God." What about Bathsheba? What about Uriah? What about the other victims, the other soldiers who died? What about their families? What about the servants that David forced to go arrest Bathsheba? How can David dare to say that it's against God only? The only way I can make sense of this is to hope that David meant that behind every victim, God, you were there. When I forced Bathsheba, God, I was acting against you. When I turned on Uriah, God, I was attacking you. And if we use the prayer that way, it doesn't downplay the victim's experience, it actually gives it more weight by showing how God is present in that violence and pain. Because remember, this is David's prayer. This is not Bathsheba's prayer. In fact, I suggest that Bathsheba should stay away from this part of the prayer at least, because it's common of victims to think that they've done something wrong to bring on this pain, bring on the harm. There's a strong impulse to blame themselves. So if your story is more like that of Bathsheba's, if you're among those who have been abused, then I'd say just stay with the first line of Psalm 51. Have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, because that is the most all-purpose prayer that any of us can pray. I want to make one final observation as we move towards the Lord's table. I've found this verse a strange one. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Now, I didn't grow up with hyssop in the garden. I'm told it's something like oregano or maybe mint. I haven't really grown up with rituals of cleansing, except maybe the one-time baptism thing. But to David, apparently, this was an important ritual. It was a public marker in the community of faith of God's cleansing work. So imagine what that would mean to see David, the violent, scheming Machiavelli, now sincerely, genuinely humbled, cleansed in the sight of all his people. I don't know hyssop, but I do know another ritual that I've seen more recently, and it feels like it fits the occasion for today. And so along with Indigenous brothers and sisters, I could say, smudge me with sweetgrass, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. We need rituals to remind our whole selves of these spiritual, deep truths, so they don't just stay ideas, but they become lived reality. And that's why we are gathering at this table to eat and drink. It's not the full meal deal, not yet, but it's a sign that the feast of forgiveness and new creation is around the corner. This is the place that we come to Jesus as bruised and broken, as sinned against and sinning, as victim, as offender. This is the place where we can beg for and be fed the mercy of God. Lord, have mercy.